From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. First, the headlines. Former President Jimmy Carter warns there is a real possibility of a second civil war in the U.S. U.S. marks one-year anniversary of attack on Capitol. Rallies held in Azad, Kashmir demanding rights of self-determination. Bangladesh destroys 3,000 Rohingya shops. And North Korea says it tested hypersonic missile. Our top story tonight. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter on Wednesday warned that American democracy teeters on the brink of destruction. He gave the warning in a New York Times guest essay ahead of the anniversary of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. The 39th President of the United States warned of a real possibility of a second civil war if the country does not rally to defend its democratic principles and institutions. 1 year ago, a violent mob, guided by unscrupulous politicians, stormed the Capitol and almost succeeded in preventing the democratic transfer of power, the 97-year-old wrote. 1 year on, promoters of the lie that the election was stolen have taken over one political party and stoked distrust in our electoral systems, Carter continued. These forces exert power and influence through relentless disinformation, which continues to turn Americans against Americans. The U.S. House of Representatives held a moment of silence on the floor to commemorate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol today. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell called the attack a dark day for Congress and our country. A mob of former President Donald Trump's supporters stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021, to stop the certification of President Joe Biden's electoral victory. 5 people died in the ensuing violence. Trump was later impeached for incitement of insurrection. Over 725 attackers have been charged for the attack so far. Congresswoman Liz Cheney praised former Vice President Mike Pence as a hero on January 6 who refused pressure from Trump. Cheney is the vice chair of the Special House Committee investigating the January 6th attack. Here, Americans in Washington, D.C. reflect on the events of that day.
That this act was a desecration in what we consider a citadel of democracy. And that the whole idea of America as a multi-ethnic democracy of the people, by the people, for the people is at stake here.
I'm a little worried not enough has changed. It does feel as though people are still trying to pretend it never happened, and it seems largely successful, honestly. Again, it's good to return to some normalcy, but at the same time, it's important to recognize what happened as well, I think.
U.S. President Joe Biden said we are in a battle for the soul of America in remarks about the first anniversary of the January 6 Capitol Hill attack. President Biden also hammered hard on Donald Trump in his speech. He's not just the former president, Biden said of Trump. He's the defeated former president, defeated by more than 7 million of your votes in a full and free and fair election.
This wasn't a group of tourists. This was an armed insurrection. They weren't looking to uphold the will of the people. They were looking to deny the will of the people. They weren't looking to uphold a free and fair election. They were looking to overturn one. They were looking to save the cause of America. They were looking to subvert the Constitution.
We cannot sit on the sidelines. We must unite in defense of our democracy in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our prosperity and posterity.
We have a special segment coming up later tonight in our show, so keep watching Muslim News. The U.S. Justice Department intends to pursue any perpetrators of the January 6, 2021 assault on the U.S. Capitol, whatever their status. Attorney General Merrick Garland, under pressure to charge former President Donald Trump, said this in a speech at the Justice Department.
The actions we have taken thus far will not be our last. The Justice Department remains committed to holding all January 6 perpetrators at any level accountable under law, whether they were present that day or were otherwise criminally responsible for the assault on our democracy. We will follow the facts wherever they lead.
Garland made no specific mention of Trump, nor did he indicate if he is being investigated. However, Garland did urge patience with the justice process as the department pursues the largest investigation in its history. So far, it involves over 725 people who have been charged. An online petition asking that former British Prime Minister Tony Blair's newly announced knighthood be rescinded had been signed by over 750,000 people by yesterday. The petition was created by Angus Scott at change.org. Scott accused Blair of being personally responsible for causing the deaths of countless innocent civilians and servicemen in various conflicts. For this alone, he should be held accountable for war crimes, Scott said. On Wednesday, Dagger al-Tikriti, president of the Muslim Association of Britain, said, "Of course, no knighthood whatsoever. In fact, people want him to be punished for the war that he has committed." Gurcharan Singh, an activist, said, "We have a system where criminals who have committed genocide and war crimes are being honored in this country, and we need to change." Critics have accused Blair of joining then U.S. President George W. Bush and sending British troops with U.S. forces to invade Iraq. This led to the deaths of at least 1 million Iraqi civilians. The invasion of Iraq also displaced about 5 million people. Over 1 million remain displaced in the country. After President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev's appeal, Russia sent troops and armored vehicles to Kazakhstan yesterday. Police said dozens were killed trying to storm government buildings in the country's largest city, Almaty. Officials said more than 1,000 people had been wounded. Energy-rich Kazakhstan is facing its biggest crisis in decades. Days of protests over rising fuel prices have now escalated into widespread unrest. Under increasing pressure, President Tokayev announced the resignation of the cabinet early on Wednesday, as well as new elections. However, protests continued. Kazakhstan is a major oil and gas exporter and the world's biggest producer of uranium. Critics say widespread corruption has meant little of that money reaching ordinary people, with average monthly salaries in the country of less than $600. Sandwiched between Russia and China, Kazakhstan is bigger than the whole of Western Europe. Kazakhstan is a Muslim-majority country with a population of 19 million. A rally was held on Wednesday in Azad, Kashmir's capital, Muzaffarabad, demanding the implementation of UN resolutions of the right to self-determination for Kashmiris. The event marked the day on January 5, 1949, when the UN passed a resolution that Kashmiris will decide about their future alliance with India or Pakistan. On New Year's Eve, 6 Kashmiris and an Indian soldier were killed in Indian-held Kashmir. Kashmiri rebels have been fighting Indian forces for more than 30 years, demanding freedom or a merger with neighboring Pakistan. State media reported today that North Korea has successfully tested a hypersonic missile in the first major weapons test by the nuclear-armed nation this year. This was the second reported North Korean test of a hypersonic gliding missile to date. These weapons are generally defined as traveling more than 5 times the speed of sound, or Mach 5. They are much harder for missile defense systems to intercept. Russia is generally seen as the world leader in technology, and the United States is also spending billions on it. China has tested hypersonic glide vehicles as well, according to the U.S. Congressional Research Service. Authorities in Bangladesh have bulldozed over 3,000 Rohingya shops. In a statement to AFP, the country's Deputy Refugee Commissioner, Shamsuddoza, confirmed the figure. Rohingya refugees from Burma are not allowed to work in Bangladesh. They are dependent on food aid. Refugees had established the small hut shops in the camp where they bought and sell small items among themselves. Rohingyas are also not allowed by the government to study beyond 3rd grade. There are about 1 million Rohingyas in Bangladesh who do not have refugee status. Rohingyas are indigenous people of Burma who were forced to flee their ancestral land due to genocide 4 years ago. The Christian Association of Nigeria has warned that 2 Muslims running on a joint presidential ticket in 2023 will not be accepted and can lead to the country's collapse. However, the Nigerian Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs says the most important thing should be competence, and that is what Muslims are praying for. The Director General of the Tinubu Support Group, Abdul Mu'min Jibrin, said on Monday that it did not matter if presidential candidate Bolo Ahmed Tinubu picked a Muslim as his running mate. He added that Nigerians would choose competence over ethnic and religious considerations. Over 53% of Nigeria's population is Muslim. The Canadian government announced Tuesday that it has agreed to pay 20 billion Canadian dollars in compensation to the children of First Nations Indigenous families. This is over a human rights complaint that has been ongoing since 2007. In it, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society alleged that the child welfare system was flawed and discriminated against Indigenous children. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled that the federal government discriminated against Indigenous children through underfunding in the child welfare system. Patty Haydu, Canada's Minister of Indigenous Services, and Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations Mark Miller held a joint press conference on compensation and long-term reforms for First Nations child and family services. First Nations peoples are known as one of the largest Indigenous communities, with Métis and Inuit Indians throughout Canada. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. To discuss the impact of the attack on the U.S. Capitol, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. It was exactly 1 year ago when on January 6th, 2021, President Trump's supporters invaded Capitol Hill and terrorized the whole country live on TV. I was still on my breakfast table when I started watching on laptop what was going on. But 1 year later, still 2/3 of Republicans don't believe Biden won the election legitimately. Where are we for democracy, for our country? To discuss that with us is a professor of political science, Tom Hogan Ash. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Great pleasure to be with you as well as your audience.
Professor Hogan Ash is a professor of political science department at California State University, Northridge. So do you agree with President Biden that Trump wields a dagger at the throat of democracy?
Yes, but the situation is more complicated. Trump is not the cause. Trump is the symptom. So for many decades, people in my line of work have been warning about the decline of American political institutions, in particular, the role of the media, and then also the undermining of faith in things like the voting system. And so, yes, Trump has come along and he has leveraged these uncertainties, and he has created division in the United States as a political strategy. And so right now, people in political science and academics around the world are quite concerned about the state of democracy in the United States, as well as the implications for the rest of the world.
President Carter, 97-year-old person, he has taken time out to write an opinion piece for the New York Times, and his warning of civil war, considering that his political science essentially seems to be the study of history of politics. Do you think there is a serious risk of civil war?
Well, I think a lot of commentators have made have noticed that we are, in a sense, already in a state of a low-grade civil war. I haven't read President Carter's op-ed piece, but it's hard to imagine a 1860 style civil war where you have two armies that are geographically, going against each other, or something worse than that. But what is, I think, likely, and what has been happening in the United States, is political violence with protests, and I would expect that kind of division, those kinds of political conflicts, to possibly escalate. The question is, how far will they escalate? And it's not really easy to predict, what's going to happen.
Well, Professor, it is said that even the first civil war, people, until it started, didn't expect it to happen. And the media and the brains and these politicians, none of them were thinking that it might happen, but it did happen. So it may not be the exact copy of it, but considering that whole lot of people buying guns. I mean, last year, minority people have bought as many guns as non-minority, which have been buying guns before. So this is the official tally which comes from FBI, but there must be much more unofficial way of, a person like me thinking, hey, if this thing happened, what's going to happen in my neighborhood? Who is going to be my ally? Are we able to defend ourselves? Do you think American living rooms are once concerned about this situation?
Well, the figure that I've seen is nearly 400 million guns in the United States in the hands of civilians. And so that is obviously an incredibly dangerous situation, a bit of a powder keg. People did see the Civil War coming, by the way. It was not unforeseen. And I don't think there's much that we can draw from the experience of the American Civil War in the 19th century. We're living in a very different age. But again, I don't see, civilians forming militias and armies and, invading different states and trying to, change the government. I think it's more likely that we see what we have been seeing, which is political violence on kind of a relatively low level. It potentially, I suppose, could get worse, but it's hard to imagine anything more like a traditional civil war with armies. What would concern me, though, is that you would have the political system in a state level political system being overthrown in some way, similar to January 6th. You may recall the Michigan State House was, prior to January 6th, was invaded by a group similar to the group that invaded the Capitol 1 year ago today. And, their goal was to hunt down the Michigan governor and, do away with her in some way. And so you could imagine the political violence being targeted, at the state level, and perhaps even targeted at American politicians, which, of course, we've seen in recent years.
Professor Tom Hogan Ash, how strong are our institutions of law enforcement, considering that a whole lot of people in the January 6th invasion had connection with the military and police and the sheriff department across the country? And a report by FBI I read recently says that FBI knows who are the extremists in police departments, but they don't share that information with police departments because they are afraid of those people being tipped off. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, when President Biden speaks in terms of Trump holding a dagger to the throat of democracy, this is one way in which I think this is true. I think Trump has done more than any American politician to try and create division between law enforcement and the rest of society. And you do see this within law enforcement. Many law enforcement who were non-political prior to the Trump era have now become more politically perhaps radicalized. And that's not a very good situation. That's a dangerous situation when you have law enforcement or also political division in the American military, which has been stoked by Trump. And so one of the ironies and contradictions of January 6th attack was the fact that so many Capitol police officers were attacked. And this was clearly a lawless effort on the part of these insurrectionists. I don't actually like the term insurrection. I prefer the classic term coup d'etat. And this attempted coup d'etat resulted in the loss of life of numerous law enforcement officers on that day, and many more injuries and mental health issues. And so, it's just a strange sort of irony or contradiction that the Trump supporters sort of wrap themselves in this idea that they support law enforcement, and yet they're willing to use violence and break the laws, and in fact use violence against law enforcement in order to maintain political power.
Professor Hogan Ash, you teach political science. What your students are talking about when they think of January 6th?
I still think they're in shock, even a year later. This generation of American college students has faced a lot. Whether the 9/11 terrorist attacks, if they remember that, the collapse of the American financial system, the hundreds and hundreds of school shootings that have traumatized this generation, not to mention the pandemic, which is incredibly unsettling for everyone. And so I think students see the January 6th attack sort of as another sort of traumatic event that they've experienced, and they're not really sure what to make of it. Obviously, I see it as a big part of my job to help students place the January 6th attack into some kind of context. And I really just hope to emphasize to students how fragile democracies are. They're incredibly fragile. And, a constitution is not going to protect the democracy. It really requires good faith of really all Americans to support not only the formal institutions like the voting system, for example, as well as the informal parts of that make democracies work, like the willingness to compromise. And so I still think students are not yet fully processing what January 6th means. And my goodness, I do feel for my students just on a personal level, if I may say, that they've had to experience yet another trauma of this kind.
Professor, what are your advice to the parents of these students, considering that as you mentioned, fragility of the democracy? I would say democracy and freedom are not static things. They go up or they go down. And we are seeing democracy going down all around the world. In India, they have open calls towards genocide and killing people and things, especially minorities, and government institutions taken over by people who admire fascism and Hitler. So what parents, what you and I can do on this January 6th to make a resolve to strengthen our democracy and freedom?
No, you're absolutely right to point out the fact that the shaky democratic institutions are not unique to the United States. This is happening all over the world, particularly Western Europe, but also South Asia, other Asian countries. And so it almost feels like a turning point in history that we're living through. Look, I wish I was wise enough to be able to offer advice to parents or Americans. But I suppose if you pin me down and I had to offer one bit of advice, and that would be not to get your news from social media. Social media is an incredibly toxic source that undermines the democracy in many ways, because what social media does is that it collates news for individuals in a way that makes it increasingly toxic, often propagating conspiracy theories that just sort of fly around the internet with incredible speed. And so, if I could wave a magic wand, I would like to recreate some of what we used to have in the United States in terms of the trust in the traditional media sources, and the reestablishment of the role of editing in the cultivation of news, where professional journalists are able to present news to Americans and filter out the falsehoods and the conspiracies so that we can have a conversation about basic facts, and we can have more agreement about how to pursue public policies in the United States. Look, I wish we could get back to where we were arguing about what the top tax rate on the wealthy should be. Should it be 39% or 35%? Those were the discussions that we used to have not that long ago in this country, and now we're talking about whether a president was born in the United States or born in Kenya. I mean, all kinds of, or who invaded the Capitol? Was it Antifa or was it Trump supporters? We're just so far away from having a basic set of shared facts, which is really critical to successful democracy.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Hogan Ash, for your time. Truly appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.